Hello and welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome to our lecture series called Prelims Powerplay. In this lecture series, we will cover the entire year's current affairs for your prelims examination this year. And we have divided all these current affairs subject-wise. Now, with the previous lecture, we started with economics current affairs. So all the important topics, very important topics that will feature in your prelims examination, well, we started with that in the previous lecture. Okay, now in the previous lecture, we started with economic growth and development. And in economic growth and development, we covered four topics. Now, within this topic of economic growth and development, there are four more important topics that will feature in your exam. Okay, so today we will cover those four topics. So let's quickly jump into the lecture because time is of the essence for you guys. It is important. You can't waste time. Okay, so let's quickly jump into the lecture. All right. Okay, then. So, yesterday we started with economics current affairs, okay, and we covered economic growth and development, but we covered this topic partially, right? And what topics did we cover? So I told you in the previous lecture that there are basically 8 topics in economic growth and development, okay? We covered second advance estimates. If you haven't covered that, please watch the previous lecture. We covered gross domestic knowledge product, a very fascinating concept. We covered that. Then we covered Quacquarelli-Simon's rankings, QS rankings, which talked about India's skill preparedness with respect to the 21st century skills, AI and all that. Then in the end, we covered household consumption expenditure survey, right? Household consumption expenditure survey, and with that, we concluded yesterday's lecture. So today we are going to begin with stagnant rural wages, and then we'll talk about food inflation, then electric vehicles versus agriculture, and then India's informal economy. Okay. So today we will complete the entire topic of economic growth and development. Okay. So please pay close attention because we are going to start with stagnant rural wages. Okay. So stagnant rural wages. Now the thing is that in the news article that featured in Indian Express as well as in Hindu, well, economics analyst said that India's GDP has been increasing for the past 5-6 years, with the exception of COVID-19 lockdown, which contracted India's GDP. But apart from that year, India's GDP is on the rise. Okay, and the economist said in that news article that India's GDP has increasing by a minimum of 6% at least, right? That means India's national income is also increasing by at least 6% year on year because GDP is positively correlated with national income, right? So India's GDP is increasing by 6%. India's national income is increasing by 6%. But analysts have found out that rural wages and agricultural wages are not increasing at all. For the past 5-6 years, agricultural wages, rural wages have been stagnant. They either grew by 0.5, 0.6% or they remained stagnant. Now, what is the reason behind this paradox? If India's national income is increasing, then surely everybody's income should have been increasing, right? If India's national income is increasing by 6%, surely everybody's wages should have increased by at least 6% or 5% or 4%, but close to that mark. But rural wages and agricultural wages have not been increasing, they remained stagnant. Okay, so what's the reason behind that? Let's talk about this because a question might be asked, a conceptual question, MCQ might be asked. Okay, so stagnant rural wages. Okay, so the thing is, this analysis was done based on the data released by Labor Bureau. So Labor Bureau periodically comes out with data points related to wages. Okay, and Labor Bureau came out with two types of wages, data related to two types of wages. Okay, one was non-farm rural wages. So people who are involved in non-farm activity, but they are employed in rural areas. Okay, so non-farm rural wages, and then there were agricultural wages, right? So people who are employed in farms. So there are two types of people, right? Even in rural areas, some are employed in non-farm employment, some are employed in farm employment. And Labor Bureau came out with data statistics related to these two types of wages. Okay. And Labor Bureau found out that wages in these two areas have not been increasing that much, despite the fact India's GDP is increasing. Okay. Now, Labor Bureau basically came out with two more facts. Okay. So, Labor Bureau gave data with respect to nominal wages and real wages. Now, I am expecting that you know these two things. What are nominal wages? What are real wages? But if you don't, then hear me out for a couple of minutes and I'll explain what nominal wages and real wages are. Okay. Nominal wages are, well, the wages you receive. Okay. So let's suppose you receive 10,000 rupees per month. Okay. And from next month onwards, you started receiving, well, 11,000 rupees per month. Okay. So we can say that your wages have increased by 10% in nominal terms. Okay. So your nominal wage growth rate has been 10%. Okay. Simple. Yes. I'll write it more cleanly. So 10,000, your wages increase to 11,000. Okay. So your wage growth rate has been 10%. Now this is nominal. But the thing is, you might be happy that your wages have increased by 10%. People who received this increment might be happy that their wages have increased by 10%. But if you look a little deeper, you'll find out that their wages actually in real terms have not increased by 10%. Why? The thing that with these 10,000 earlier, they used to afford a particular quantity of goods and services. Okay. With these 10,000 rupees, the person used to buy these goods and services. But after 1 year, inflation, he found out, inflation was, let's suppose, 10%. Okay. So inflation rate was 10%. That means after 1 year, these goods and services would cost around 11,000 rupees. Make sense? So actually, if you see, this person's wages have increased by 10%. Earlier, he used to afford 10,000 rupees. Now earlier he used to receive 10,000 rupees. Now he receives 11,000 rupees. But earlier he used to receive these goods and services. Now, after 1 year, these goods and services cost around 11,000 rupees only. So in real terms, in his purchasing capacity, his wages have not increased. Before also he was able to buy these goods and services. Now also he's able to buy these goods and services. So in real terms, if we take a look at the purchasing capacity of this person, his purchasing capacity has not increased. So we will say that his real wages have increased by 0%. His purchasing capacity has not increased at all. Yes. So this is real wage growth rate. So real wage growth rate is equal to nominal minus inflation. Okay. So when you subtract inflation rate from nominal wage growth rate, you get real wage growth rate. In this example, nominal wage growth rate was 10%. Inflation was 10%. So his real wage growth rate came out to be 0%. If the inflation was 5%, then his real wage growth rate had come out to be 5%. Okay. So now let's get back to the data released by Labor Bureau. And Labor Bureau says that sure, in nominal terms, wages have increased by 6%, 7%, 5% in rural as well. But in real terms, they are near about stagnant. So in nominal terms, people might be happy that their wages have increased. But if we talk about their purchasing capacity, well, that hasn't increased. Their real wages haven't increased. Their wages adjusted for inflation hasn't increased. Make sense? So wages have remained stagnant in real terms. Though real GDP has increased, but wages have not increased in real terms. And this is the data released by Labor Bureau. Okay. So this is the data for nominal wage growth rate, as you can see over here. Okay. So it is above zero. Nominal wage growth rate as far as agricultural wages are concerned and rural wages are concerned. Okay. This is above zero. But when you talk about real wages over here, then you see that zero is over here. Okay. So real wages have sometimes been below zero. That means if adjusted for inflation, people wages declined. Okay. So in terms of real wages, well, real wages have been roundabout close to 0%. So he says, or not he, Labor Bureau says that real wages have remained stagnant despite the fact that national income or GDP has increased. Real GDP has increased. Okay, as you can see over here. Now, this is not important for us as far as our prelims examination is concerned. What is important for us is what are the reasons behind this stagnation, right? So there are two particular reasons behind this stagnation, and let's talk about that. Reason number one is higher female labor force participation rate. It has been found that female labor force participation rate has increased. Now, because of this increase, well, labor wages or wages have stagnated. Now, you might say that this is good news. Female labor force participation rate increasing, this should be considered good news. Then why is it yielding bad results? Well, for that, you need to understand one important concept. Okay? You see, wages in general are dependent upon two factors: demand and supply. Like everything in economics is dependent on demand and supply. Price of everything, this pen, this headset, my shirt, price of everything is dependent upon demand and supply. When demand for one particular thing is higher than supply, well, prices increase. And when supply for a particular thing is higher than the demand, well, prices decline. Now, what is price of labor? Price of labor is wages. So whenever there is high demand for labor, you are demanding so much labor, but there are not many laborers in the market, wages would increase. But when there is high supply of laborers, there are so many laborers in the market, there is not much demand for labor, well, then wages would decline. Now, earlier females did not participate that much into the labor force, so the pool of labor was small. But now with the entry of females in this labor pool, supply of labor has increased vis-a-vis demand. And that is why wages, there is a pressure on wages, declining pressure on wages. Okay. So yes, this is a good thing. High female labor force participation rate is good thing because we are concerned with women empowerment. But this is having an unintended consequence of increasing the labor supply, which puts a downward pressure on wages. And this increase in female labor force participation rate is very high in rural areas. It is especially high in rural areas, not so much in urban areas. And this is also counterintuitive. Female labor force participation rate is high in rural areas. And because of that, well, rural areas have increased supply of labor, and with that, you see stagnation in rural wages. Simple. So this is reason one. Now let's talk about reason number two. See, the newspaper article started with the fact that our growth is increasing, but rural wages are not increasing. Now, the reason behind this is that our growth is mostly driven by capital intensive industries as compared to labor intensive industries. Now, look, all industries have these two major inputs. Every production process has two major inputs. Okay, labor, capital. Okay, now an industry is called labor intensive industry when majority contribution in that industry, in the output of that industry, is made by laborers. When that industry is more labor dependent to produce, that is labor intensive industry. And when an industry is more capital intensive, it is dependent more on capital rather than laborers. to produce, then it is capital intensive industry. And what do I mean by capital? Well, capital means tools, machines, factory plant, okay, plant, machinery, tool, software, all these things come under capital. So if your industry is more dependent on machines and tools, okay, not so much on laborers, then you're capital intensive. Example is, well, infrastructure industry, construction industry. Construction, well, it's a mixed bag, but then there are many industries which are automated, more dependent on machines. Then there are labor intensive, which are more dependent on laborers. Okay, for example, textile industries, leather footwear industries, they are more dependent on laborers. Machines do not play that much of a role. Now, this article makes an argument that in India, much of the growth is coming from capital intensive industries. That means capital intensive industries are driving growth, whereas labor intensive industries are not driving that much growth. So, labor intensive industries are not growing if we compare it to capital intensive industries. So when you see at India's GDP figures, you say India's GDP is rising, but that rise is coming from capital intensive industries. So the laborers employed in labor intensive industries are not seeing that much growth. And because they are not seeing that much growth, well, simply put, their wages are also not rising. So India's growth is majorly driven by capital intensive industries as compared to labor intensive industries. And that is why wages have remained stagnant. Okay. Now, one more important thing. You know, if your growth is basically driven by capital intensive industries, then these industries benefit. Cement industry, steel industry, infrastructure development companies, they benefit from capital intensive growth. Why? Because they are dependent on tools, machines a lot. But benefits of labor intensive industries, well, if your growth is driven more by labor intensive industries, then these industries benefit. FMCG stands for fast moving consumer goods. Well, these are those goods that are found in supermarkets: chips, shampoo, body wash, moisturizer. These are fast moving consumer goods. So if your growth is not, if your growth is driven by labor intensive industries, that means wages are rising. And when wages are rising, people have more money. When people will have more money, they will spend more on these shampoo, toothpaste, chips, all these things. So fast moving consumer goods industry benefits. When people's wages are rising, consumer durables, microwave oven, TV, fridge, they benefit. When wages are increasing, two-wheeler sales increase, car sales increase. Okay, so benefits of labor intensive industry is to them, benefit of capital intensive industry goes to them. So this article says that the reason why rural wages particularly are stagnant is because, number one, labor supply has increased because of high female labor force participation rate. Number two, growth is driven by capital intensive industries. Okay, though there is one good thing in all of this. Okay, what is that one good thing? Well, if rural wages are not increasing, well, government is somehow compensating for that, and government is compensating for that through various income transfer schemes. Government is transferring money directly into the bank account of people so that they are able to spend it on different goods and services. Even if their wages are stagnant, government is helping them by transferring money into their bank account. For example, there are many schemes. PM Kisan is one such scheme. Then Sukanya Samriddhi account. Then there are state government schemes like Ladki Behan Yojana in Maharashtra, where you are incentivized, money is transferred into your bank account if you have girl child and all that. Okay, so income transfer schemes have somehow helped rural decline in rural wages or stagnation in rural wages. That's it. So this is why it is called mitigation factor, that this is somehow compensating for stagnation in rural wages. All right, okay, so this topic is done. Now let's move on to next topic, which is impact of food inflation. Okay, now the thing is, we all know that inflation, very high levels of inflation, is bad for the economy. Why? Because if inflation is very high, then people are not left, people's expenses increase, and when people's expenses increase, their budget gets destabilized, so they are not left with that much savings. And when they are not left with that much savings, they won't spend it on luxury goods and other goods. Okay, basically inflation impacts, well, household budgets a lot. Now, there is one category of inflation that impacts the household budget the most, and that is food inflation. And in fact, very high levels of food inflation is considered bad for the economy. Why? Because if food inflation is very high, then most of your household budget would go towards buying food. You will be left with very little amounts of money to purchase other things: TV, fridge, fast moving consumer goods, all these things. You'll be left with less money to purchase that. Therefore, demand for TV, fridge, two wheeler, four wheeler, FMCG will fall, and these industries would also start to show some losses. So, your economy would basically face a kind of loss if there is high food inflation, because high food inflation leaves little money in the hands of people to buy these goods. So, therefore, factories that are producing these goods would face losses, and that would be bad for the economy. That is why government is a lot concerned about food inflation. Okay, government wants to control food inflation. Now the thing is, this news item argued that the impact of food inflation is higher on urban households than rural households. I'm sorry, it's the opposite. The impact of food inflation is higher on rural households as compared to urban households. If there is very high levels of food inflation, rural households are more vulnerable to it, are at a disadvantage way more than urban households. And this article has given a reason for that. Okay, so let's talk about impact of food inflation. Okay, now the thing is that very high levels of food inflation leaves less money with people for goods and services. This actually reduces aggregate demand in the economy, which is bad for the economy, right? Because most of your money is spent on food. But this impact is higher on rural households as compared to urban households. And why is that? Well, as you can see, well, there was this graph in this article. This is not that important. Okay, this graph said that rural demand is doing well. But still, this article has argued that the impact of food inflation is higher on rural households. And why is that? Well, you remember in the previous lecture, we covered household consumption expenditure survey. We talked about this, right? And this household consumption expenditure survey is important because it gives the data for the consumption pattern of different households. Now, based on the data of household consumption expenditure survey, we have found out that within the monthly expenditure budget of rural households, the share of food category is higher. As you can see in this, you can see that this is the monthly budget, monthly expenditure of rural households. This is the monthly expenditure of urban households. And in this, you can see that food and beverages category in rural households has higher weightage as compared to urban households. An average urban household spends around 36% of his budget on food items, whereas in rural areas, an average household spends 54% of their budget on food items. Therefore, if food inflation is high, well, 54% of the budget of rural households get destabilized, whereas this percentage is very low in case of urban households, right? So the whole purpose of including this news item is to introduce you with this table. Okay, just remember this fact. That's why this news is important. Just remember this fact. Weightage of food and beverages categories higher in rural households as compared to urban households, and that is why food inflation impacts rural households more than urban households. Just remember this fact. Okay, just keep this fact in mind because an MCQ might be constructed out of it. Okay, That's all. That's all you need to know as far as this news item is concerned. Okay. All right. Now let's move on to our seventh topic within economic growth and development, and that is electric vehicle versus food. Okay, EV versus food. Now, what is this debate all about? You see, the thing is that now electric vehicles are a new reality. In 21st century, now more and more vehicles would be electric, right? Now, these electric vehicles run on batteries. Yes. Now, the problem is that these electric vehicles which run on batteries, these batteries require some raw material. Now, some of this raw material is also used in manufacturing fertilizers for agriculture. Now, if you'll divert more of this raw material towards battery manufacturing, then less would be left for fertilizer manufacturing. So there is an either or situation, zero sum game. If you favor electric vehicles more, then farmers are going to suffer because there would be less availability of fertilizers for their crops. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. If you favor fertilizer, I'm so sorry. If you favor fertilizer industry more, then this green transition that we are talking about, that global warming should be stopped and electric vehicles is the answer, well, that would suffer, right? So these two things, electric vehicles and food, fertilizers, are at loggerheads with each other, and this is what this article is talking about. Okay, so let's talk about this: electric vehicles versus agriculture. So earlier the debate was food versus fuel. Okay, what was this debate all about? You see, currently government has said that all petrol and diesel, mostly petrol, should be blended with ethanol. You must have heard about this. All petrol should be at least blended with ethanol. 10% of all fuel that cars are using should contain 10% ethanol. So ethanol blending program started. Okay, so most of your petrol is blended with ethanol. Problem is that ethanol is created from sugarcane, rice, and other food crops. Problem is, if you are blending ethanol with all the petrol that is being used in cars and trucks and buses, well, you would have to divert sugarcane, rice, other food crops towards ethanol production. But sugarcane, rice, and food crops, well, are also important for food security, right? So there is this food versus fuel debate. Because if most of this rice and other food crops are diverted towards ethanol production, there will be less supply of rice. High demand for rice, less supply of rice. This would lead to price rise, food inflation. So food versus fuel debate was already raging. Now this new debate has come out, and that is food versus cars. And what is this food versus car debate? Okay, you understand food versus fuel debate. Now, what is this food versus car debate? Okay, food versus car debate is, well, most of these cars are electric vehicles, and these electric vehicles, well, are battery operated. Now, a particular category of battery is required for powering these electric vehicles, and that is known as lithium phosphate batteries. Now, these lithium phosphate batteries require phosphoric acid. Problem is, phosphoric acid is also required in manufacturing diammonium phosphate, which is also a fertilizer. The problem is, if you are diverting more phosphoric acid towards battery production, then less will be left for DAP production. And DAP is the second most used fertilizer in India. So less will be left for DAP production, less fertilizer availability would be there. High demand for fertilizer, supply of fertilizer, fertilizer inflation. This would impact farmers the most, and it would also impact food security. This is the issue. Okay, so we are talking about phosphoric acid. Now, phosphoric acid is a key ingredient in diammonium phosphate, which is the second most consumed fertilizer. Okay, but phosphoric acid is also a key ingredient in lithium iron phosphate batteries. Okay, basically lithium iron phosphate batteries use iron phosphate as cathode. Now phosphoric acid is required to create this iron phosphate, which creates cathode in these batteries. Okay, now the thing is, earlier electric vehicles used these batteries. Okay, NMC, nickel, manganese and cobalt. Okay, nickel cobalt acid batteries. Okay, these were the batteries that were earlier used, but now more and more manufacturers are using LFP batteries, lithium iron phosphate batteries. Okay, so earlier electric vehicles were powered by NMC NCA batteries, but now they're using LFP batteries, and LFP batteries typically are powered, or a key ingredient is phosphoric acid, which is important for fertilizer. In fact, it is said 40% of global EV capacity is now based on LFP batteries. Okay, this was 6% back in 2020, but now 40% of demand for batteries for electric vehicles comes from LFP, and LFP requires phosphoric acid. But phosphoric acid is important for DAP. Okay, so why are people preferring LFP batteries over NMC and NCA? First of all, NMC and NCA require cobalt. Cobalt is very expensive and is also scarce, very scarce. So that is why people are favoring phosphorus, because iron and phosphorus are quite abundant as compared to cobalt. Okay. Plus, lithium iron phosphate batteries are low cost. They have high longevity. They can sustain for longer periods of time, and they're also safe. They don't overheat. Whereas NMC, NCA batteries overheat. Okay. Yes, their longevity is high, safety less, overheating and fire risk. LFP batteries have only one disadvantage, and that is they have low energy density. They produce less energy as compared to NMC and NCA. But the fact is that they are low cost, they are chargeable, they are safe. That is why manufacturers are preferring LFP over NMC and NCA, despite the fact that it has lower energy density than NMC and NCA. Okay, make sense? Now, how will this impact India? Okay, because India requires a lot of DAP, Indian farmers require a lot of DAP. So how would this impact India? Implications for India. The thing is, half of India's DAP requirements are met through imports, and most of these imports are from China, Morocco. Okay, so half of our DAP comes through imports. Now, if China is using phosphoric acid for batteries, then they would use less phosphoric acid for DAP. Then there would be shortage of DAP in China. That would increase prices of DAP in China. That would impact our import bill, right? Because our farmers require DAP. Then for domestic production, 50% of DAP is produced in India. Okay. But for producing DAP, we import phosphoric acid or rock phosphate. And already most of the world's phosphoric acid is being diverted towards batteries. So our import bill is going to increase again. With more demand for LFP batteries, less will be available for DAP. This would lead to supply shortage impacting food production. Okay. And less DAP would also cause inflation in fertilizer. Now in India, fertilizers are provided at a subsidized rate to farmers. Now farmers are going to say that fertilizer has become expensive, therefore government should help us out. Now if DAP becomes expensive, but farmers don't want to pay that much, then government has to increase its subsidy. This would increase our subsidy burden, government subsidy burden, right? So it is bad news for India. We have to find a solution to all of this. Now, these are the two charts that will be given in your notes, so go through them. India imports most of its DAP from China, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and India top rock phosphate producers are China, Morocco, USA again. Okay, so go through these two charts. Just remember top 4 countries. All right. Now let's move on to last news item of the day, and that is informal economy. The thing is that our entire economy can be divided into two parts: formal economy, informal economy. Okay, Formal economy contains registered enterprises that are registered under Factories Act, Companies Act, GST. So all the registered companies, registered production, well, they are part of formal economy. But a significant chunk of our GDP comes from informal economy, and informal economy contains those enterprises which are not registered. They are not registered anywhere under any law of the government. But if you really want to understand Indian economy, you need to understand informal economy as well. But they are not registered. So it is very difficult for the government to keep tabs on them, to basically understand them, to know about their data, their production, the laborers they have employed, and all that stuff. Therefore, to understand informal economy, Ministry of Statistics periodically, annually, does a survey, and that survey is known as Annual Survey of Unincorporated Enterprises, okay, ASUS survey. So this news item or this topic is related to that. So let's quickly talk about this item, okay, this news item. So informal economy. Now the thing is, informal economy is very significant, okay. It is said that 50% of our GDP comes from informal economy. 3/4 of employment comes from informal economy, unorganized sector. Now 50% of your GDP, 3/4, that is 75% of your employment comes from informal economy. That means informal economy has a huge chunk or huge share in your total economy. But it is very difficult to gather data about it because most of these production units are unregistered, right? So to get more data about these unincorporated enterprises, unregistered, unorganized enterprises, government conducts a survey that is called ASUS, Annual Survey of Unincorporated Sector Enterprises. Okay, ASUS. Now just remember for your prelims, this survey is conducted annual. So A stands for annual. Okay, and this survey is done by Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Basically, there is an agency under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, NSO. They do this survey. Okay, so remember this fact. This fact is important for your prelims, and MCQ might be asked. Now, ASUS is for enterprises in the unorganized or informal sector. Now, what type of enterprises are there in unorganized or informal sector? Well, these include MSME, micro, small and medium enterprises, household units. Some people open their production, their factories in their own households and they're not registered. So they are also part of informal economy. Now, household units either can have hired workers or own enterprises, that you are the only worker in your own household unit, okay, or your family member. So all these are included in informal sector or unincorporated enterprises. Now, this survey that is done by Ministry of Statistics, well, it is of unincorporated non-agricultural establishments. Remember, non-agricultural, because farmers are also producers, but farm economy is different. Okay, so we do not include farmers or farm economy. Okay, we only include those enterprises, those production units which are non-agricultural. Okay, so this survey, which is done by Ministry of Statistics, is the survey of unincorporated non-agricultural establishments. Now, these unincorporated non-agricultural establishments can be of three types. Okay, three types. Number one is manufacturing, so they manufacture any good. Then trade, they do trading, so they buy a particular good and they sell it. Okay, these include your local kirana shops, kirana stores, mom and pop stores in the households. Okay, and then other services. For example, cobblers are there, weavers are there, tailors are there. Okay, so very small people, very small cobblers who have their own cobbler shop in their own homes. Okay, they are included in other services. So these are your unincorporated enterprises. Okay, now the thing is that remember this fact: informal economy contributes 50% of your net output. Now, economic output is your GDP. So 50% of your GDP comes from informal sector. This is important. 75%, fourth of your employment comes from here. Okay, And the reason why government does this survey of informal economy is because informal sector is important. Two reasons I've mentioned why they are important. Number one, output. Number two, employment. The third reason is that informal sector is the only sector that absorbs unskilled or semi-skilled labor. So there are so many unskilled laborers in our country, semi-skilled laborers in our country. They won't get employment in registered enterprises. But informal sector, unregistered enterprises provide this avenue to even unskilled workers also. So unskilled workers also get gainful employment in this sector, and that is why this sector is important. Okay. Now this survey had many data points. Okay. This survey conducted by Ministry of Statistics on informal economy had many key highlights. We are not going to cover all those highlights because, like I said in the previous lecture, that we are only going to focus on only on that information which is important for your prelims. Information that is not important for your prelims would not be covered, would be skipped. Okay, we have to be focused on our prelims examination. Okay, so as far as this survey is concerned, there were many revelations in this survey. We won't cover that because they are not important for your prelims examination. But this survey said that informal sector in India is suffering a lot. Okay, and the reason is that in the past 10 years, this sector, informal sector, faced three major external shocks. What are these three main external shocks, also known as exogenous shocks? Number one shock to this informal sector was demonetization in 2016. Why? Well, most of these informal enterprises are cash based. With demonetization, they suffered naturally. Then the second big shock that they received was GST implementation. Because these small enterprises, these informal enterprises are suppliers of raw material to registered enterprises. Now, because these registered enterprises were suffering because of GST implementation, so they were not placing enough orders to these informal enterprises. Now, that's why they suffered. And the third biggest shock that informal sector faced by far, and that was COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, COVID-19 induced lockdown. And the impact of COVID-19 was such that informal sector is still not completely out of this shock. Okay, that is why I've written 2022 present. The thing is that large enterprises, large companies were able to survive COVID-19 because they had large pool of savings. They were big companies. They had large pool of savings to sustain themselves through these lockdowns. Small enterprises, informal sector did not have large pool of savings. So they suffered heavily. And they suffered so much during this time that they still have not fully recovered from this shock. Okay, so these are the three exogenous shocks that informal sector faced. So from this news item, you just have to remember two things. Number one is these exogenous shocks, and number two is who conducts this ASUS survey. Okay, and that would be all. With that, we conclude today's session. And with that, we also conclude topic number one from economics, that is economic growth and development. Now, the thing is, your preparation would be better if you revise these two lectures, if you revise this lecture from the notes provided by us. But those notes shall be available shortly in a couple of days. And along with these notes, I would also provide some MCQs because after all, we are preparing for prelims. How can you prepare for prelims without MCQ practice? So we are also going to provide you with MCQs from these lectures and the notes. The link to those notes and MCQs shall be provided in the comment section below each and every lecture. But it will be available in a couple of days' time, so don't worry. Okay? Alright? So your job should be to watch the lecture sincerely, to revise it from the notes, and to practice MCQs. Only then you can be sure of your prelims examination. Alright. That would be all from my side, guys. And I will see you next time with next topic in this lecture series called Prelims Powerplay. Thank you, everyone.